Margareta, can you see the screen okay? That's fine. Thanks very much. Well, I am now going to start the last lecture in this first series. I have threatened you with a further series starting next May. And if I'm alive then, and if anyone by that point is still listening, I look forward to seeing you then. Let me make a start. I've entitled this lecture, Popper the Person. From the lectures so far, you will have gained only, as it were, a few glimpses of Popper as a person. But what was he actually like? My comments in what follows will of necessity be subjective. They're not things in respect of which I'm in a position to evaluate what has happened. They are also very fallible, as they depend just on my memory. You shouldn't rely on them uncritically, and I may, as I found after giving the last lecture, when I was talking about the Popper's visit to the opera, that it might turn out that I've got everything wrong. However, I will endeavor, as I've done before, to correct that in the notes. My problem really is that in these comments, there's a lot against which I will not have anything to correct them. First of all, some physical stuff. When I attended Popper's lectures as an undergraduate student, he must have been 64 years old. When I worked with him, it was over the period when he was between 69 years old and 77 years old. Popper was quite small. He's a bit shorter than me. He was quite thin, but rather wiry, with a large, rounded chest. As he got older, his back was slightly hunched. He normally dressed casually, with light gray trousers, a shirt without a tie, and often an old light gray sweater, which in fact he continued to wear after it started to develop a hole in it. I think he was quite attached to it. When he was dressed up, however, you might have taken him for the conductor of an orchestra. Popper had a large head, but in a certain sense, a key feature was his massive ears. They were very large, but not prominent. They didn't stick out, but they were very long. In his youth, he had been very active. He was a keen mountain climber and walker when he was in Austria, and also certainly for mountain walking in New Zealand. He still enjoyed walking when I was there. The Popper's household diet was really rather Spartan, and so there was little chance of his putting on weight. He was active into his late years. After the death of his wife, he moved to live quite close to where his secretary and her husband were living. And there was an airfield nearby from which people were running gliders. And he looked up at these, said, oh, I'd like to go up in one of those, and had a go at this when he was in his 90s. If you met him and had any kind of academic background, he would at once take you into his current academic work. He would explain to you with animation the problems upon which he was working. Indeed, You could well say that he lived for his work. He worked virtually all the time, not infrequently when I was working for him, working right through the night. If he was captivated by some new idea or new chain of thought. His long-suffering wife rather enjoyed foreign holidays, typically, or I guess especially, to Switzerland. They would go occasionally, but if they went, it would not be long before a stream of academic writing started to arrive through the post from Popper. What about his circumstances? When I knew him, he lived in a small detached house on a large lot or large plot in what's often referred to as the stockbroker belt. This is an area in the countryside outside of London in which quite typically stockbrokers or other wealthy people might live. He had bought the house they were living in based on a generous fee that he received as a lecturer from Harvard from giving the William James lectures there, I think in 1950. He never actually delivered a manuscript of these to them, as he was actually obliged to have done. My understanding about this is that a recording was taken of the lectures and he was going to work from that, but that at some point was lost. And it would appear as if the lectures themselves had been improvised by Popper from rather scanty notes. Some notes are available in the Popper archive, but there really isn't much to them. So it's almost impossible on the basis of those notes to reconstruct just what he was saying. I had the opportunity to talk to an elderly man who'd attended the William James lectures and who told me a little bit about them, but I think that no one has given an account of what was in those lectures. And I think it's not obvious how one could reconstruct what they were. In the immediate period of Popper's retirement, he wasn't very well off financially, as he had only a small pension from the university. He drove a car, but he wasn't the kind of person by whom you would wish to be driven. And while I was working for him, the distances that he drove thankfully diminished, and that's really very good. There is a rather nice story about Popper as a driver that I came across in the British Publishers Archive at the University of Reading. And this is a story told by Ernst Gombrich in a letter to Herbert Reed, who was one of the editors at Routledge. And Herbert Reed, this is the chap who was who wrote about art and was also a well-known theoretical anarchist. And Gombrich, to sort of introduce Popper, said, well, I can tell you the following story, that Popper was learning to drive, and that Popper was really absolutely sure that the way to drive was somehow to empathize with each pedestrian in the street as you were going past, so that you could anticipate whether or not he or she might step out onto the road. So it's quite an interesting approach to driving. Later on, Popper received several awards with cash prizes attached to them. And after his wife died, when he moved his house, he got a good price for the land attached to the old house. So things then became quite comfortable. And he started then to collect a few editions of books in which he was interested. Popper worked at home By the time that I was at the LSE as a student, he typically placed all his teaching and his departmental seminar into a single day. Just everything was done on Tuesdays. Lecturers then often delivered just one lecture a week for each course for which they were responsible, while tutorials were typically taken, not always, but quite typically taken by graduate students.
Dada, nila nakatotis.
Could you silence the, could everyone mute themselves? Whoever was speaking then is interrupting. This meant that academic staff could undertake a lot of research. Subsequently, when I worked for him, I would call Popper by telephone at about 9:15 in the morning from the LSE after he had received his mail and pen. And this would normally lead to a stream of requests from Popper for books and articles, which it was part of my job to obtain and then to take out to his house once or sometimes twice a week. I should mention that this was in the period, obviously before the internet, and where one typically had to actually get things physically or to make photocopies of things. The house itself was near to a small town called High Wycombe, about 30 miles away from the London School of Economics. When Popper was first appointed at the LSE, there was a restriction on how far away the LSE staff could live from the London School of Economics, and the Poppers lived as far away as they could. Popper's wife was somewhat reclusive, and so they were really happy to be living some way away. There's a sense in which the house and their style of life, although they were in England, remained Austrian. The public areas of the house were very neat, without what one might call the rather casual spread of books and the comfortable but slightly messy style that one might find more typically in upper middle class or professional British homes. Although it should be said that by contrast with this, the area in which Popper himself was operating was chaotic. A short film clip, which Luke has sent to me, has a talk that Popper gave in German, but with English subtitles, which has been set onto completely unrelated shots of Popper at his house, that's at Fallowfield, from which you can see a little of the interior of the house, and also you can see shots of him kind of wandering somewhat aimlessly around in the small village of Penn. And I will put into the notes, and I got here on the screen, a reference to the YouTube availability of this clip. The Poppers had various Austrian friends, and it seemed to me that their casual friendships, as opposed to those from whom they had more formal visits, and Popper's academic contacts were typically drawn from this group, although the Poppers' own lives were very self-contained. If you went to their house as a visitor, it was on a small road called Manor Close, off a long private road, a good way from the nearest main road, and it had speed bumps, also called sleeping policemen, on it to stop people speeding. If you went to their house, you'd be taken into the main downstairs room. This had a couple of comfortable chairs in it with a slightly kind of Bauhaus look to them, and also a coffee table. The chairs were, in fact, designed by Popper himself. The room itself was large, although quite spartanly furnished, although there was a grand piano there. There were also some closed, quite low, glass-fronted bookcases along a wall, with books in them relating, I seem to recall, to such things as Nansen the Explorer, to mountaineering and so on. But I also think that there are a few philosophy books there from Popper's father's library. If you were in the room and had come as a visitor, Lady Popper would typically at some point serve you tea or coffee and German biscuits. What about the rest of the downstairs? Well, there was a hall with a small loo off it, a somewhat Spartan kitchen, and there were also two other rooms. In one of these, Popper worked. There was a large desk against a window, and this is where Popper did the bulk of his work. He typically wrote longhand on long so-called foolscap size sheets of a special sort of paper, which he had got hold of on one occasion and then like writing on. And one of my tasks was to bring down packets of this for him. The desk itself was covered in papers, and this is the desk, and these were the papers on which Chunky, the marmalade cat, who I referred to in an earlier lecture, would sometimes, much before my time, have been found making herself comfortable. There was also a smaller table at which, when I went out to pen, I usually worked with Popper, and the two of us would sit at this table and then work over manuscripts, look at letters that had been sent to him, and I'd take notes about how responses should be made to them and so on. There were also bookshelves full of books, including, and I'm pretty sure that it was the Paul Edwards Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but it could conceivably have been the multi-volume Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, and which also contained some papers. The book most consulted, however, which sat in these bookshelves, was a pocket Oxford English dictionary. Popper would very often consult that. Popper at one point said, well, is there a particular book that he had, which I would like to have left to me in his will? And I said, well, in fact, it was this small Oxford English dictionary, because I got such strong memories of his looking at that to check matters. Popper also made extensive use of Fowler's modern English usage, to which Popper had a very strong attachment, and which he would consult to resolve problems just about how English should be used and constructed. Fowler's book has been updated more recently, but it was the original Fowler, which Popper used. The other room was small. It again was lined with bookshelves. Onto these, Popper's wife stacked the various editions of his books. Popper's wife, that's Henny. I should say that when I was first working with him, I was addressing her as Lady Popper. And at one point, some while into when I was working with him, I was, as it were, formally invited to call her Henny. And this is a bit like, as I understand it in German, people can be understood to move from the formal to the familiar form of grammatical address. She would stack various editions of his books there, and also she'd put there books in which he had a contribution, where he was then sent a copy. She also put various other books in there, including correspondence with authors, which was stuffed into some of the books. So that when the University of Klagenfurt in Austria acquired Popper's books, they also got this material. So Klagenfurt have a copy of the material in the Popper archive at the Hoover Institution, but they also have some additional materials. And the additional materials, as I understand it, came from stuff which Henny had put into the various books. Klagenfurt, I think, got a not terribly good deal with Popper's books, just because Popper typically worked with books that were borrowed from libraries rather than his having his own large research library. David Miller punctiliously, and I also, but rather less punctiliously, kept a record of the material which we obtained for him to work on, and that record is amongst the things which are in the Hoover archive, and of which the Popper Library will itself have a copy amongst its photocopies of the Hoover material. This is important to bear in mind if someone is doing research on Popper's work. For the books which ended up in Klagenfurt represent only a small fraction of what Popper consulted when he was engaged in academic work. I remember hearing from, I think, an Italian scholar that he had planned to go to the library to see what books of Freud's Popper had and whether he'd annotated them, and was really quite shocked to find either nothing or virtually nothing there. But that doesn't mean that if Popper was writing about something of this kind, he wouldn't actually have had books to consult. I know at one point when I was working with him, he was doing work on the Frankfurt School, and he had me get a good number of books written by different members of the Frankfurt School, notably Horkheimer, which I brought out and which he was consulting. The records from David and myself will thus offer some guidance as to what Popper used in the relevant periods. But in general, his assistants will have brought him and then will have returned the substance of what he was working with academically. Indeed, a number of the books that Klagenfurt ended up with were actually ones which people had sent him and which were kept in his LSE office. That's to say, they weren't books that he was consulting at all because he wasn't there in that office to consult them. In the other room, there was also a table at which Lady Popper sometimes typed. There was also a desk in the bay window in the main room, at which she had a typewriter and at which she much more typically worked. And I think also that they usually ate at that table as well. I very occasionally had a light evening meal with them there if I'd been working at Fallowfield for a particularly long time into the evening. And the meal would typically consist of Ryvita crisp bread, a slice or two of ham, some cottage cheese, and a bit of fresh fruit, which broadly bears out my earlier comment that Popper wasn't going to get fat on what they were normally eating. Occasionally, there might be a treat in the afternoon. If, for example, a friend had sent them a Sachertorte from Vienna, and I was lucky enough to be at the house on one occasion when this had happened, and so had a piece of that in the afternoon. I must say, I don't quite know why people get so worked up about it, but at any rate, it was nice, but again, pretty exceptional. I never went into the upstairs of the house. The house was called Fallowfield. It was for the area quite small, but it had a very large plot. On the other area of which, away from the house, there were trees, and I'm pretty sure the remains of a small orchard. In the summer, Popper would sometimes, but not often, sit in the front of the house overlooking the garden to work or to read. And a large table there was sometimes used for lunch for friends of his, including for his 70th birthday, Peter Medower and Ernst Gombrich and their wives, and I think also Lionel Robbins. I was invited there, and also Popper's then secretary, Pam, whom I later married. What it did mean was that the area where the Poppers were living was very quiet, which they really appreciated. It's interesting that a commemorative plaque has been put on the outside of a house in which Popper and his wife initially lived in London. Those of you who've been to London may have come across these round blue tiled commemorative plaques indicating that a particular figure lived at a certain house and the dates when they were living there. The location is in 16 Burlington Rise, Barnet, London, EN4 8NN. I say it's interesting because while they lived there, they absolutely loathed the place. Compared to New Zealand, where they'd been living before, it was noisy. I might mention just in passing that if anyone is going to Christchurch in New Zealand, apparently space in the house they used to live in New Zealand is actually available via I've got it, the house letting thing. It isn't Airbnb, is it? I mean, whatever the thing is called. And they were bothered by music and so on from the radios of neighbors, which is something they just hadn't been troubled with in New Zealand. They were delighted to be able to escape to the quiet of Penn. I might mention in passing that I know that they loathed the house because there was an Austrian refugee who Popper assisted to get to New Zealand. And he and his wife actually bought the house off the Poppers, where the Poppers had been living. And they continued really quite a personal correspondence for a number of years. And it actually, it's held not in the Popper archive, but it's held in an archive at Christchurch in New Zealand, the university archive there. And from this correspondence, one can get a real feel of the Poppers' concerns and attitudes. What there wasn't back at Fallowfield was a regular newspaper. Popper didn't get a newspaper delivered. They also had no television. Lady Popper had a small radio upstairs, but downstairs there was just quiet and Popper's work. However, Popper did receive a good number of visitors who often left a newspaper for him. They'd read a newspaper and they might leave it at the house when they left. Popper was also in regular contact with various friends by telephone, including Brian McGee, who at one time was a Labour and then a Social Democrat MP, and who very much kept Popper up on political events, on what was going on. What about health? Popper lived until he was 94, but suffered from various health problems. A key one in his later years was an allergy to tobacco, to the point when he couldn't enter a room, for example, to lecture, in which someone had been smoking in the last 24 hours. And this at a time when smoking was ubiquitous, posed a big problem. And his assistants at that time, if in his lecturing, when I was an undergraduate there, would have to go and check that the room was okay, open windows, sort of try and disperse any smoke that might be around. Apparently, it gave him a lung infection. And this also served in many ways to cut him off from contact with colleagues at the LSE. And indeed, at the time, and certainly up in the latter parts of the 1960s, when I was studying as an undergraduate and then as a graduate student at the LSE, almost everybody in the place smoked. I mean, not all the time, but where this would have really meant a considerable problem for Popper, including, for example, that people would smoke in the senior common room, the staff common room there. Popper also didn't drink. This, as I understand it, was a consequence of his having seen the social consequences of alcoholism in Vienna and feeling that he couldn't himself drink if he was urging other people not to do so. And I was really quite struck in this context when Popper received the Sonning Prize in Copenhagen. I was his assistant at the time, and he was accommodated in, and they had the ceremony in, I think, the Hotel d'Angleterre in Copenhagen. And it's it's a sort of large, expensive hotel. And I remember that they had a dinner there, and wine was served, and they made a point of serving Popper grape juice in different varieties, matching the color of the wine, so that actually no one could see that he wasn't drinking the wine. Popper also suffered from heart murmurs, at one point a detached retina, and was regularly worrying about his health. He and his wife also tended to complain about lots of things, although this, I've been told, is simply part of the style for which the inhabitants of Vienna were well known and laughed at by other people in Austria. Popper spoke good English, but with a very distinctive accent. An Austrian friend of mine, Professor Alfred Schramm, was able to replicate Popper speaking English brilliantly by pronouncing English after the style of old-fashioned high bourgeois Viennese German. Micromanagement. In line with his complaints about other people, Popper tended to feel that no one could really be relied on to do things quite right. I think David Miller is probably an exception to this, but certainly no one else. This led, on the one side, to his being unable to delegate, including the consequence of this was that he took on the management of all the foreign rights in his work himself, rather than having his publishers handle them for a fee, or rather than having a literary agent. While on the other side, it meant that if you were working for him, he would give you elaborate instructions as to exactly how everything should be done. His attempted micromanagement of the process through which the Open Society was initially to be placed with a publisher almost ensured that it never got published. That's to say, it only actually ended up having a publisher because Popper's instructions weren't actually completely followed. I recall when I first started to work with him, being told exactly how one should prepare manuscripts and correct proofs, which is obviously very important. But also, one was told how to fold a letter and place it in an envelope so that it wouldn't be damaged if anyone used a letter opener to open the envelope. I was also, as his assistant, sent at one point to literally stand over a printer at a printing works to make sure that corrections to a book were made exactly as they should be done. I think that this was some corrections to Logic of Scientific Discovery. At the same time, Popper was always dissatisfied with his own work and made unending tiny corrections to it. I mean, in a way that just wasn't particularly effective. He'd have done much better, I think, to have put that to one side and to got on with getting other stuff into print. As to his personal style, Paul Lazarsfeld, the Viennese and subsequently US sociologist, is reported as having commented about Popper, who he knew from political activities, that Popper wouldn't be a leader, or at the same time, he wouldn't be led by other people. He was certainly a striking mix. Paul Feyerabend reports on being impressed when he first met Popper, probably at Alpbach, because of Popper's somewhat disrespectful attitude towards the discipline of philosophy and towards great philosophers. Popper was clearly convinced that philosophers had done a disservice to humanity, and there are a good number of put-downs of philosophers in his work. Popper was irreverent and disrespectful in his approach to philosophers, particularly philosophers who took themselves seriously. Yet at the same time, he was passionately concerned about issues and deeply serious in his approach. Let me offer you a few vignettes. First, Popper has told me that he upset the Cambridge philosopher C.D. Broad, who was interested in psychical research, by saying in the discussion of an address of Broad's, something along the lines of, the problem about ghosts is that they don't say anything interesting, which seems to me actually to be just about spot on. Look at supposed spirit writing. For example, there is a book that H.G. Wells is supposed to have dictated from the spirit world. And I mean, all one can say about it is that if Wells had survived, certainly his intellect didn't seem to have done. Second, there was Popper's dispute with Wittgenstein. This has been written up in the book, Wittgenstein's Poker, and much attention has been paid to whether the account that Popper offers of this in his autobiography is or isn't correct, with eyewitness accounts being given on both sides of the argument. Popper was invited to give a paper to a philosophy society in Cambridge, which at the time was dominated by Wittgenstein and which met on this occasion in Braithwaite's rooms. The topic on which Popper spoke was whether there are philosophical problems, or whether, as Wittgenstein at the time thought, there were no such things as genuine philosophical problems, but just puzzles. On this, Popper seems to me to have been completely and utterly right. But the issue which gave rise to controversy related to whether, when asked by Wittgenstein to give an example of a moral rule, Popper had said not to threaten visiting speakers with pokers, Wittgenstein apparently having been fiddling with a poker from the fire iron and making use of it to emphasize points in discussion. Popper reported on Wittgenstein as having stormed out of the room, slamming the door after him. People commenting on the event seem to agree with at least the latter point about Wittgenstein slamming the door, although some have stressed that Wittgenstein tended to slam doors when he left anyway. It is, though, interesting that there are remarkably divergent reports on the event. Wittgenstein's Poker reports on this, and there's been some later correspondence about it, I think, in the Times Literary Supplement. I would say that I, at the beginning of this lecture, said you need to bear in mind that insofar as what I'm saying now is based on my own recollections, I don't suppose they're any better than the eyewitnesses to this particular event. I've come across, however, an additional report not known to the Wittgenstein's authors, poker authors, and also to those who subsequently discussed the issue in the Popper archive in New Zealand. The Popper archive there, it's not very large, but it contains some material from Popper. It contains some material relating to his appointment in New Zealand. It contains the correspondence between the Poppers and this friend of his who bought their house, and it also contains this other report. And this broadly backs up Popper's version of the story. What about some general issues? Popper was certainly feisty and wasn't someone to be intimidated. He was also critical of Wittgenstein's views. In fact, an interesting paper was prepared by Paul Feyerabend, who you might recall translated Popper's Open Society into German, in which Feyerabend drew together criticisms of the early Wittgenstein made by Popper in the Open Society and also in the manuscripts of Die beiden Grundprobleme into a systematic critique of the early Wittgenstein. In the Open Society, there are lots of footnotes on all sorts of topics, including critical notes about Wittgenstein. This paper, which hasn't been published, is in the Popper archive, although one could put together the content of it from the material in the Open Society and from the material which has been published in Die beiden Grundprobleme. At the same time, Popper acquired a reputation, this was later on, for intolerant conduct towards visiting speakers at his own seminar. Certainly, they were liable to find themselves interrupted. It was recounted, but this wasn't my experience, and I don't know if this story is correct, but one speaker never got to the end of the first sentence of his paper before being interrupted, and the discussion then going on from there. Feisty critical interchange, however, was certainly part of the style of the seminar, and it generated a very lively and interesting atmosphere, and one which was very stimulating for students. Undergraduates could attend by permission, and I was able to do that. Popper, however, also sometimes came down hard on people, young and old. Bartley, in a contribution to a Popper Festschrift, discusses him in effect browbeating a young man to get this chap to admit that he'd surreptitiously changed his mind in the face of criticism when presenting his ideas without actually admitting up front that he was changing them in the face of criticism. Here, I think the problem was that Popper felt that a key issue intellectually was that people should admit when they're changing their mind or changing the character of their views. Not that there's something wrong in doing this, but that it's problematic if it's concealed or if it isn't recognized that people say are engaged in an intellectual retreat and still behave as if they're maintaining what they initially said when in fact they're now no longer doing that. But I think here Popper was driven by his intellectual concerns to behave in a manner which one could judge to be somewhat problematic. Bartley, though, tells the story as if everything was fine. You might have come across the quip, the Open Society by one of its enemies, a quip which has been attributed to Ernest Gellner. It was said of Popper that he was intolerant generally. Several things I think should be said about this. First, he had the bad luck to be working in England at the height of ordinary language philosophy and of the influence of the later Wittgenstein, not just on people in Cambridge, but on English philosophy more generally. And thus, he was working in an intellectual atmosphere that really wasn't receptive to his work. It also meant that his ideas were readily misunderstood, and he also tended to be assimilated to the positivism of the Vienna Circle when he saw himself as a dedicated critic of their views. In addition, Popper's interest in science and his moral seriousness were a little bit out of kilter with how things were done at the time. And it was typically, I think you could say, a setting in which people who were clever and urbane made the running. Freddie Ayer, I believe I'm right in saying, reports somewhere that he felt that Popper didn't really think that Ayer was a serious philosopher, I guess really just because of the difference in their characteristic style, and that Popper was concerned really with big problems. Popper, however, also had some spectacular breaks with some of his own students. First, there's Joseph Agassi, an extremely clever, if slightly prickly Israeli. He had a close relationship with Popper, which ended in disagreement. There were issues, I think in part about priority, concerning what they'd each said about the relationship between metaphysics and science. Issues which it isn't all that clear how one can easily evaluate them, just because Agassi was writing his PhD thesis, which discussed certain of these issues, but was at the same time working as Popper's assistant. But at the heart of their disagreement was something on which I think that Popper was clearly correct, namely that Agassi was increasingly writing in a way that made it difficult for his readers to work out what he was saying. Agassi's own view of their relationship is set out at length in his very interesting book, The Philosopher's Apprentice. A second case of problems with Popper's students was Bartley. I actually remember when I first met Popper and went to his house before I was given the job, him talking to me about just the sort of great feelings of affection he'd had for both Agassi and Bartley, and just how sorry he was that their relations in the end had broken up. Bartley had come to work with Popper from Harvard. Bartley was very smart, he was a handsome guy, he was gay, but an odd mix of the urbane and very insecure. He had apparently intended to become a minister, to go into the church, but then had moved away from this. And he wrote at the LSE an interesting PhD dissertation on issues to do with rationality and the philosophy of religion, the bulk of which went into his retreat to commitment. I think Bartley was right in his critique of justificationism and as seeing a rejection of justification as being at the heart of Popper's approach, although there are other people who work with Popper and are very keen on his work who wouldn't agree with that judgment of mine. And I think that Bartley was also right in discerning that some formulations about rationality in the open society were problematic. And I think that he made a good move in suggesting so-called comprehensively critical rationalism as a response to this. But I think it wasn't clear when he criticized Popper to what extent he was saying anything that Popper didn't, in fact, pretty much agree with. Exactly what was going on. There was a big bust up at the following the Bedford College conference in 1965. What was going on is a bit difficult to work out, and I think it wasn't helped by the role played by Imre Lakatos in stirring things and making things really rather difficult. Bartley and Popper were eventually reconciled, and he brought the postscript to publication, and they were in touch with one another. Bartley was going to write a biography of Popper and did a lot of research work on that, interviewing a lot of people who'd known Popper in New Zealand, for example. But I personally felt that Bartley's later work lost a bit its critical edge. Why were there disagreements? I've got a conjecture about this. It related to what I've referred to before, Popper's willingness to bring people into whatever his current concerns were, and to the close way in which he worked with them. I suspect that it may have created misleading impressions, such that when people turned to criticism that Popper didn't feel was very significant, they didn't get quite the sort of reaction that they had had before. By contrast, however, another of Popper's students, David Miller, collaborated with Popper, worked closely with him, assisted him, for example, in the writing of replies to my critics in the Schilp volume, but also produced some devastating criticism of Popper's work on verisimilitude without there being any breakup in their relationship. I also think that Popper tended to feel that he was working with his close students and assistants as if, as it were, they were a team. I was struck, and David Miller has told me that he has had the same experience, that when I asked Popper to look at something brief that I had written, he didn't just look at it, but he basically then kind of extensively rewrote it as if it was his own work. Popper, I think, was disappointed when people to whom he was close, in a situation in which critical rationalism was widely rejected, were concerned with criticizing him on issues that seemed to him inessential, rather than working collaboratively on improvements to critical rationalism, or indeed rather than engaging critically with other views that were out there. Although once again, it's striking that David Miller raised key problems about Popper's views without there being any personal disagreement. What I think was really sad was Popper's disagreement very late in his life with John Watkins. Watkins had been a dogged champion of and developer of critical rationalism, and also had been a good friend to Popper. And say, when he was head of the philosophy department after Popper had retired, Watkins resolved all kinds of problems for Popper. Indeed, while I found Watkins difficult to get on with personally, it seems to me that he was one of the best of the critical rationalists. However, in his Science and Skepticism, he suggested a range of, in some cases, fairly dramatic departures from the substance of various of Popper's views, suggesting these as improvements to critical rationalism, which by that point, I think the very elderly and very isolated Popper found just simply too much to take. I think he just got too old to be able to respond to this as it would have been good for him to respond to it. What about Lackatosch? Well, it's sometimes been justly remarked that people with paranoia may in fact have people conspiring against them. And in the case of people subject to the activities of Lackatosch, one had someone with a background in the politics of communist Hungary for whom British academic politics was small beer. I mean, it's a bit like an adult dealing with activities in a nursery. He had in Hungary done some pretty ruthless things, and also apparently had produced a denunciation of the work of a Hungarian politician by cleverly compiling quotations from his work, which, if put together, looked intellectually incriminating. Lackatosch himself had done some very interesting work in the philosophy of mathematics, which, as I've mentioned earlier in the lectures, was in some ways in a tradition with other work that had been taking place in Hungary. And he also raised some interesting issues about Popper's philosophy of science, although I think that Lackatosch overemphasized the degree to which many of his, that's to say, Lakatosch's ideas were new, and also, as I've argued earlier, took things off in I think, rather problematic directions in suggesting philosophy of science not as tentatively standards against which current developments in science might be judged, but rather as suggesting certain standards which were in some sense implicit in the best of science as it unfolded. Popper himself was, in academic politics, an odd mix between the unworldly and lovable and also someone who attempted to be but was ineffective as a player. Lackatosch wished to build up his own reputation by taking over leadership of the Department of Philosophy at the LSE on Popper's retirement, and by way of effective self-promotion and networking, something at which Popper was himself hopeless, to create a kind of school and to try to place his pupils in leading positions in the discipline. I've said something about his interactions with Thomas Kuhn about this earlier on. Lackatosch, in accomplishing this, did remarkably well, but it led to some rather nasty personal clashes with Popper. Popper, eventually anticipating that he would die first because Lackatosch was a good bit younger than him, wrote a response to Lackatosch in The Philosophy of Karl Popper, in which Popper was highly critical of Lackatosch as a guide to his work, and effectively said, look, just don't trust Lackatosch as he's presenting my views as being a good guide to what they are. I was waiting with trepidation for, as it were, the shit to hit the fan, just because I was working at the LSE. I was kind of standing somewhere between Popper and Lackatosch. Lackatosch had made various comments to me, which one, I mean, it'd be wrong to take them as being threats, but one didn't really want to be in this sort of position. And to my personal relief, but horror that I felt like that, Lackatosch suddenly died of a heart attack before The Philosophy of Karl Popper and Popper's critical response to him appeared. Popper, in fact, rewrote an initial version of a response to Lackatosch, on which he'd worked with David Miller, which I think was actually much better than what was actually published. And I think it would really be good if the original version of this could be published. A summing up of some of these things. Popper seems to me to be offering something which is different and distinctive intellectually, and which I think is extremely promising and intellectually exciting. He inspired a lot of affection from those who worked with him, but didn't, I feel, handle very well the kind of interplay between collaboration and criticism that an effective partnership in such circumstances needs. Popper was also poor at academic networking, which had the result that those who worked with him typically didn't do very well in the job market. Popper indeed warned me when I first went to see him before I started working that working with him wouldn't help in getting me an academic job. A further problem is that Popper had incredibly wide academic knowledge and academic interests in a very wide range of issues. He was critical of the shift towards ever greater specialization. However, knowledge, as a matter of fact, has developed in ever more specialized ways, and it seems to me not feasible for one person to try to continue in Popper's own path there. And he often encouraged people who were working with him, if they had an idea about something, just to work on it and to write on it, which just, I think, was a tactic which became trickier just as the field got more complex. But this isn't something that he would have liked, I think is called for a suggestion for institutional reforms, such that they then can give us a way to combine critical discussion of programmatic ideas at a general level with the interaction between this and more detailed work, and for people to get proper recognition for engaging in all such activities rather than just in the highly specialized material. In general terms, it seems to me that today much in philosophy is in some ways closer to Popper than it was when he started working in the UK. But there are also aspects to his work which are distinctive and which offer a real and I think a very important alternative to current ideas. I'm not, I think, all that hopeful for the immediate future of critical rationalism, just because of the lack of younger people in philosophy in academic institutions who are interested in critical rationalism as a distinctive tradition. And the problem, if I'm right, of fitting the kind of work to which critical rationalism would lead one into the current structure of academic life in philosophy. However, both David Miller and Alan Musgrave, who in their work exemplified an approach much closer to analytical philosophy than I'd be led to by how I see critical rationalism pushing us, were both very talented and have done very well and have got recognition for their positions, although I would say that John Watkins was very slow to get a chair, and that was only at the LSE. David Miller ended up just as a reader, when one would really think that someone of his brilliance and important contributions should obviously have got a chair. Let me, as an appendix to the talk, just talk briefly about working with Popper. What of my own story? I'll say just a little about this to conclude the talk. I had taken a BSc Econ special subject philosophy. I'd gone to the LSE to study economics. I happened to take a course in logic. I've talked about this earlier on, which was taught from a Popperian perspective by Alan Musgrave. I found it the most interesting thing that I was doing, and I effectively took largely a degree in philosophy within the BSc Econ degree, and then stayed on and did an MA degree in logic and scientific method. I planned then to qualify as a university librarian and then to return to philosophy, probably having to finance it myself. However, while pursuing the librarianship, I was a graduate apprentice at Durham University Library. An old friend of mine, Larry Driskman, with whom I regularly discussed philosophy, asked me if I'd consider applying for a philosophy job, which he'd seen advertised, and he sent me the details. I contacted my former tutor at the LSE, John Watkins, and he wasn't particularly encouraging. I mean, he said, because the department in which the job was advertised didn't like the LSE's approach. I suspect that he may just have been being nice and that he had doubts about his ability to give me a strong reference. But he asked if I would be interested in working for Popper as his assistant, for Popper's current assistant was in the course of leaving to return to his own professional work in psychology. I was very interested. I mean, it seemed to me a bit like asking a young Catholic if he'd like to work personally for the Pope. I went to see him, managing to catch the wrong train so that I wasn't there when Popper came to meet me at High Wycombe Station. Some fast trains went from Paddington, some slower trains went from Marylebone. I thought he wanted me on the Marylebone one, and he didn't, and he met the other train. He nonetheless talked to me and said that he'd like to hire me. My initial work was on checking manuscripts. That's to say, Popper was an excellent English stylist, but he tended to lose track of his English when he was heavily into developing an argument. And so he'd be writing in English, but sometimes the English would go haywire, or sometimes there would be Germanisms in the style of it and so on. And part of my job was really to read over the material and to make suggestions as to how it should be revised to bring it into colloquial English. Subsequently, I was engaged in gathering material for him to work on, in reading proofs and doing an index, for example, to objective knowledge. I played a minor role in relation to the replies in the philosophy of Karl Popper. He was largely working with David Miller on these, but I helped with the revision of Unended Quest and with a whole range of papers in a whole range of different areas in philosophy. I did a lot of work on what became the myth of the framework and played quite an active role in relation to Popper's contributions to the self and its brain. As I indicated, I worked extensively with Popper on the myth of the framework. I worked with him on it really to the point where only a relatively small number of issues needed to be sorted out before it would be ready to go to the publisher. But at that point, Lady Popper requested that work on this be halted and that we should instead turn to work on the companion volume, Physics and Philosophy. This was supposed to be a companion volume which would have reprinted Popper's papers on physics together with a small amount of unpublished material. A difficulty about it, though, was that Popper's views had changed over time, and there were also some problems about at least one of the papers which Popper knew about, but which he hadn't sat down subsequent to its publication to consider how might be remedied. I think, though, it would have needed someone with really good technical knowledge in the fields to which he was contributing in quantum theory and on the arrow of time to work with him and discuss with him what annotation was needed, and probably to work with him on writing an introduction which explained what was going on. What else did I do as part of the job? Well, it seems, when having talked to people in Austria, to have been a bit like the job of an assistant to a professor in Austria. In my case, a combination of academic duties plus all kinds of other stuff, including picking up a visa for him from the Indonesian embassy. I managed to lose what turned out to be his father's much treasured passport cover, and fetching his hearing aid from a factory somewhere outside Manchester. I read proofs, drafted material for him on the basis of conversations, was used as a sounding board for ideas, collected working materials, met visitors who wanted to see him, but whom he couldn't see because of his commitments at the time. I remember all too well a meeting with an Egyptian professor who spent most of a day with me when he was hoping instead to see Popper. And we hit here the interesting problem that while we had some good discussions, for someone from Egypt, the social distance which is comfortable is, for me, a social distance which was much too close. And so he kept moving towards me and I kept moving back. I also then had to go out to see Popper by train and bicycle once or twice a week, and would also, in the period before cell phones, get calls at odd times. These would be made. I didn't have a telephone myself where I was living. It was just in a couple of rooms, and these calls would be made to my landlord, who would then come up and see me, and I would have to go down and take the call, possibly at the weekend. I learned an incredible lot, but in some ways that I'm sorry that I couldn't have worked with Popper when I was rather older. I would have been much more use. I could also have learned a lot more from him. And in addition, there was a problem that I came across with Popper, which is that sometimes I might have some misgiving about an issue that he was addressing, and I would raise the issue, and Popper would make changes to his manuscripts, but he'd make it clear that, as it were, he was making the changes as a favor to me because I'd raised the matter, rather than because he thought that it was actually necessary. And I think, had I been a bit older, it might have been possible to press Popper a bit more on this. And there is a degree to which his own emphasis on objectivity and so on might be seen at a certain level as a kind of corrective to his sometimes himself operating for good or bad on the basis of subjective judgments about people. Popper was kind, but it was difficult not to feel stupid if one worked with him. In addition, I was pursuing research on what eventually became my PhD. Luckily, this was on Hayek, in whom Popper had an interest, but he had, as it were, no particular stake in the interpretation of Popper's work. And this meant that there was no room for any tensions to develop in terms of the content of things, or for tensions which might boil over into personal tensions. I eventually received promotion from being a research assistant to being a faculty level research officer, but I then hit the problem that I was on the same pay scale as university lecturers, and if I'd stayed in that, I would have got more senior, and would have moved up this pay scale without getting any lecturing experience, which would have made it difficult for someone else to appoint me, because the convention typically was that one didn't appoint someone downwards on the pay scale. This meant that had I stayed in the position, it would have been difficult to get a job as a lecturer. I left Popper for a temporary job in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. Overall, it was a fascinating experience. As I've indicated, I don't think that I learned as much as I should have done just because I was young, immature, and stupid. But I was left in awe of Popper's knowledge and his capacity for hard work. Indeed, at one point, there was an early exchange, I think, on a postcard with his fellow Austrian Ernst Gombrich along the lines of, in England, all chairs are easy chairs, meaning that in their experience, university professors didn't really seem to work as hard as they would have expected them to. Popper was an odd mix, critical of academic pomposity, but in a sense, typically coming to expect respectful treatment himself as he got older. And also in some ways, he was a simple and humble man, but at other times he tried ineptly to work the system. I am very happy to have worked with him, and I think that his work is still very much worth pursuing. I'd wish to see the critical rationalism that he's opened up with brilliance, but often unsystematically, develop into a full-scale research program, about which I will talk in the first of the second series of my lectures next May, assuming that actually these things do take place. Let me now call a halt, and if you'd like to get in on the discussion, heckle, whatever, just stick an electronic hand up, or if that doesn't work, gesture furiously. Philip.
Hello, yes, hi. Could I ask about the contrast between his post-1950 isolation and what seems to have been his style beforehand? It seems to me that, you mentioned they didn't have a newspaper delivered, they didn't have a television set at Penn, yet when he was in New Zealand, he was very actively engaged with a whole host of things that were happening at the time. He was active not only academically, but also in the WEA in New Zealand. When he was in Austria, he was, again, very drawn into a whole host of activities and kept himself up to date on events, it seems. So I'm struck by this remarkable transformation, it seems to me, in a move to isolation. And I wonder how that has fed into his philosophy, his work. I know that, for example, more or less at the same time as he moved to Penn, he develops his concept of the abstract society, and yet it seems in some ways that it is he who has abstracted himself. So there's that. And then, if I may, I have some subsidiary or related questions concerning how this affected his awareness and engagement with events at the time, notably the 1956 events in Hungary, and perhaps even before that, more importantly before that, so of course he was in Stanford during the actual uprising in Hungary, but before that, the 20th Party speech, which was disclosed in all the newspapers in June of 1956. I mean, it had happened in February, but it seems that Popper didn't really engage with that until almost a year later. And possibly this is because he was off the cycle, out of the news cycle. And connected with that, if I may, one other issue, I mean, this is something I've recently discussed, or some of us have recently discussed, concerning his post-1992 comments at Hayek's, after Hayek's passing, regarding the European Union and the Maastricht Treaty, and how aware was he at that point about some of those rather remarkable events, which in fact he engaged with, but he engaged with in a perhaps not well informed, or maybe only particularly partial information. So it's, I mean, his comments seem strange, and as indeed certain other elements did. And finally, final bit of this, if I may, at his very last work is on television, which I find or that was what he was writing, as you have mentioned on previous occasions, towards the end of his life. Yet this is a man who had been absent from most of his experience with television was limited, and yet at the end of his life he almost adopts a kind of platonic attitude to the need to censor television, to control television, to avoid its evils. Yet he seems to have had remarkably little experience with TV, or indeed with the culture, the modern culture to which it was connected. So if I may leave you with those host of questions.
Okay. First of all, isolation. I think key factors here were his wife, who it was really pretty reclusive. I mean, there is in this correspondence with this chap in New Zealand a kind of humorous piece that she wrote about her venturing on across London on the Underground, and clearly this was something that she utterly disliked, and so on. And I think that a significant influence on his relative isolation was her. I think also that another very important and significant issue at the LSE was tobacco, because much of the intellectual exchange that went on between academics at the LSE was in the senior common room. I mean, basically, people would have lunch there, they would have coffee there, they would talk and meet, and that Popper was basically closed off from that because of his allergies. What I would say is that he certainly seemed to enjoy having visitors out to talk with, and he also talked a lot, for example, with Brian McGee and other people, and McGee was very much on top of political issues and would talk with him about them. Alas, there weren't transcriptions of these things. So if you look at the McGee-Popper correspondence, there's some initial letters that are most interesting, but you tend then just to get McGee sending him postcards, because I think for each of them, telephone was good, and also for Popper, because deafness was also a problem, that a telephone conversation was very good. I mean, and one other feature of this, and that is that Popper really had significant hearing problems. And this meant that a lot of his conversations with people would often consist of his trying to reconstruct what they must have been saying and then responding to that. And occasionally Popper, it got Popper into difficulties. For example, I think there was I believe, if I'm right about the occasion, there was an interview, or there was a program on Dutch television, and Popper and Eccles were being interviewed. And then I think there was discussion after this where someone was wanting to ask him a question about violence, and Popper understood the person to be saying finance, and so these things added up. I mean, my impression was that Popper, while he was older, was rather more sociable after his wife's death, and I just find it difficult quite to assess those things, what the impact of that was. The second thing was 1956. If Popper was in Stanford then, what I was going to say about it was that that was when Popper had a detached retina. He'd been trying to revise the proofs of the postscript,
yeah.
And basically his effort in doing that just broke down. And I think a key thing to bear in mind is that for Popper, typically it was work on technical stuff that got him absolutely captivated, and that his interest in social and political matters tended to be rather more marginal. And it's certainly also the case that his wife thought that his real reputation should be for on philosophy of science and on stuff to do with science. And so she basically put a veto on the public, on further progress with the method, the framework. And this was likely to mean that he was somewhat restricted in what he commented on. I don't think that there is any particular change of personality there, so much as something which was a product of different circumstances. The Maastricht stuff, I think by then he was not likely to be following those things carefully. And in addition, it's worth bearing in mind that with regard to Bosnia, he was very strongly pro-intervention, but that was actually of a piece with his kind of active internationalism in Notes in the Open Society. So I'm not sure that that was that there was a kind of marked difference there, but it was also the case, I think, that Popper wasn't someone who was typically following political matters very closely. I should also say that I heard, and this is just hearsay, that a minister, I think from a conservative government at some point, came out to sound him out in terms of getting a knighthood, and that Popper basically blew it by berating him about the government's over-friendly policies towards South Africa. And so, I mean, he's someone who had, who kept informed but at a distance about a number of things, but he certainly wasn't someone who was kind of politic about his views or concerned about ruffling feathers.
Well, can I just and I know other people are waiting, so let me make this very quickly. It seems to me that perhaps he had views that were cultivated by others around the 1992 episode, and I am wondering whether there is a remarkable re-engagement with a number of political issues from 1989 onwards, from roughly after, I think Henny died in 88, if I remember correctly, and so it's the last, and he does seem to re-engage afterwards.
Yeah.
And that's when his comments on Salman Rushdie, for example, are recognized, when he makes this statement on the Maastricht Treaty, and when he also talks about Bosnia, and also starts writing on television. But so that's another striking thing, that he re-engages, but selectively. And I'm wondering whether that's because he had now a group of friends who were leading him in that direction, or perhaps in some respects, or influencing them.
I don't think particularly. I think it's more that after Henny's death, some of the factors which might have made him keep clear of that engaged him more. In terms of the stuff about television, I mean, he obviously had been just before that in a situation where he was viewing television. And I'd say three things about it. I mean, I think that his approach in terms of government licensing and so on is highly problematic. I think, though, that his concern about the undermining of our sensitivities is a serious one and is continuous with some other things in his work. But I also suspect that the fact that he had been not engaged with the development of television probably then meant that when he got to see it, as it were, in all its glory, a lot of these features hit him in a way in which they wouldn't hit other people. I mean, it's a bit like if someone has been taking a kind of slow poison over a certain period of time, the next increment wouldn't make that much impact. And I think that I find his suggestions about that, which can be related in some ways to his concerns about the ethics of medicine and so on, are quite striking, but I personally think rather problematic. And but wearing the hat of my own political tendencies, I would tend to say that there is a risk that Popper sometimes is over optimistic about what one can actually expect out of government and its operations. I mean, not that the aspiration may not be good, but what one would actually got if one put some of these things into practice might be a little different from what he's thinking. Can I go to some other people now? We can come back to you later again. Luke, I have you next.
Well, just one small thing about Wittgenstein and the poker. Peter Muntz also had a vision. He was there. He was present, and he also wrote about it. And it's again another version, but somewhat similar to the one of Popper. And in that version, it was Russell who said to Wittgenstein, put down that poker at once. I don't know if you've read that one from Peter Muntz.
Yes. Sorry, but what I was doing, yes, I know all about that. What I'm doing is saying that there was also another man from New Zealand who was at that meeting.
That's Peter Muntz, probably.
Yeah. No. This is because this man effectively wrote that. I mean, he knew of Peter Muntz's account. He said that his recollection of it was very similar to Peter Muntz's, only he said something slightly different about where Russell was sitting. So what I'm trying to say is that there was the Wittgenstein's poker. There was then correspondence about it from other people, which Watkins tried, I think, at one point to sum up. But there is also in this Christchurch Popper archive a letter from someone who was, I think, an MA student with Popper in New Zealand, who then went off and spent his career as an administrator in Papua New Guinea or something or other of this kind, but who had briefly been in Cambridge and who'd got permission to attend that meeting. And so what I was reporting was that there is an additional voice beyond the Peter Muntz one, which was in almost exactly in agreement with Peter Muntz.
There's something else. I have a very long interview of Kiesewetter with Gombrich. And he said that Gombrich and his wife visited every 2 weeks, Popper and his wife in the weekend. I don't know. You know about this? So,
sorry, you haven't said what happened.
That Gombrich and his wife visited Popper and his wife every 2 weeks.
Yes, yes. But you see, this bears out what I was saying about Popper's Austrian friends, because there was someone else, I can't remember now the name, but I would could probably be constructed if I looked at Popper's address list. But there was another guy from Austria who had not an academic at all, who Popper was friends with, and who also met with them. So that basically their more immediate social circle was, I think, the Austrians, but they also had these visitors, various academic and international visitors and so on.
Yes, yes. I also read in that interview, it was a guess of Gombrich, that the trouble with Agassi and Bartley, that Popper wanted a son, and that this is a different kind of relationship, of course, and maybe he saw these Agassi and Bartley as a kind of substitute for a son. Yeah.
Well, it's clear that Popper's relationship with them was particularly close, and that I think that he was very much hurt by the fact that it fell apart. But I mean, Agassi, I know only very slightly at a personal level. Bartley I got to know rather better, but only when he was living in California, and I met with him a few times when I happened to be over there for other purposes. And so I just can't throw any light on that. What I would say is, in terms of Bartley, there is a certain amount of rather indirect evidence in the Watkins and Lackatosch archives at the LSE. But what might be very interesting is that Bartley himself was personally somewhat insecure, and he reacted to this by keeping punctilious records of correspondence and so on. And I thought that all of this had been lost, but it looks as if it actually turned up in a, well, in English, you'd call it a lockup. I mean, a kind of garage used for storage purposes in Berkeley. And it looks as if this material will eventually end up in the Hoover. Now, what I don't know is what is there, whether his correspondence is there. I know nothing about the content. I know nothing, and I'm out of this particular loop. But it may be possible to reconstruct more of the latter parts of this relationship later on. What I also don't know is that there is this guy, I've referred to him before, the Catholic priest who, Artigas, yes, who wrote in a critical way about Bartley and Popper and ethics. And he has highlighted some points about, for example, just what it was that Bartley made contributions to, suggesting that it was the appendix to the Open Society, not to the revision of the text of the Open Society. I don't know if there is anything in the Popper archive going back to corrections to that edition of the Open Society from which any of that could be reconstructed. But, I mean, what you report the Gombrichs as saying isn't unexpected. And I'd also say that the guy to whom you referred, is it Kiesewetter? Yeah. Well, I at one point went to see the Gombrichs to ask if I could take copies of their correspondence with Popper with an eye to possibly publishing it. Kiesewetter had apparently done this before and has what I suspect to be a fuller record of that correspondence. And I say this just on the grounds that by the time I was visiting the Gombrichs for this purpose, they were really quite infirm, and it wasn't altogether clear whether they could locate everything. The impression that I had was that Kiesewetter had earlier on been rather more forceful in extracting material from them. And what that means is that he may well have a fuller record of the correspondence. Certainly, he's got a fuller record than is in the Hoover. He may have a fuller record than I was able to get from copying the material that the Gombrichs had, just because he might have been able to get his hands on more material at the Gombrichs.
I don't know, isn't he older than you, or?
Who, Kiesewetter?
He was also a student of Popper, eh? Was it before you, or?
I didn't think that he was. I mean,
Yes, he was. Yes.
Well,
he was a student of Popper, eh? Yes.
Well, I had never heard of him in connection with the LSE.
Yes, he was there in the LSE.
I mean, all I'm saying is I had never heard of him, and I've never met him. But all I do know is that he, I think, has got a full and sorted out version of that correspondence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's the next now.
Okay. John?
Yes. I just wanted to briefly mention, having lived here for 25 years, the ability of the Viennese to complain is truly legendary. From your remark before, they really can complain about anything in a city where there's nothing to complain about. So I just wanted to ask, it's quite clear that Popper sort of did become quite a bit more conservative later on in life, and I was sort of wondering about how that came about if you compare, let's say, some of his later views to the Open Society. And my conjecture is it might have something to do with being very, very disappointed with the Frankfurter Schule, and they gave him really ample reason to be disappointed with the left. What is your feeling about that? The left, the new left, just turn him off so much that it made him sort of want to be more conservative?
No. I guess what I'd say is this. Popper has given as an argument for a shift in his views that he came to the conclusion that his hopes for an egalitarian society and individual freedom, he became convinced that there was a tension there. So the Frankfurt School had no influence whatever on the formation of Popper's views.
No, I mean his revulsion at the Frankfurt
School.
No.
I mean, he wasn't. I mean, he didn't like them. I mean, I personally think that there is more. Well, I think that it is a shame that he reacted in quite the way in which he did to Habermas, just on the grounds that, well, this is, I'm going to talk about in the second series of lectures. But
just reading the Positivismus-Streit just now, sorry.
But you see, the problem in a certain sense is that in the first piece in the Positivismus-Streit from Habermas, he was still in a kind of Adorno-influenced mode. What he then does is tries to offer reconstructions of kind of Frankfurt School concerns, but imminently within more analytical philosophy and pragmatism and so on. And I think that also, I mean, Habermas, if he gets a good idea, what to anyone else would be half a page is for him a book and a half. So, and he's kind of, so I think that there are many more commonalities. Jeff Sampson's, what am I talking about? Jeff Stokes' piece in the Cambridge Companion is an interesting reading by someone who likes Popper of commonalities between them. I think he actually gets it wrong and is much too kind to Habermas, but I think personally, Habermas actually himself moved rapidly closer to Popper, but that this was never really explored. In terms of Popper moving to the right, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind this stuff that, for example, I put into after the Open Society, this thing with McGee, where Popper is suggesting
nationalization.
Yeah, I mean, on an well, there are two kinds of things. I mean, first of all, in his early correspondence with Carnap about this, he is clearly open to ideas about nationalization on an experimental basis. What he is critical of, and he is surely 100% right on this, is the notion of socialization as a cure-all. I mean,
certainly.
But he then, in correspondence with McGee, is suggesting really in the 1970s, well, couldn't government take a within certain limits a controlling interest in companies? So I mean, if people claim that Popper moved to the right, it is a very strange right. And there's continuing criticism on Popper's part of ideas about laissez-faire. I mean, I think that he just never really gets to grips with what, say, Hayek was actually arguing. And so, I mean, there is certainly a shift, but it seems to me that Popper in the Open Society is no longer a socialist, but he's quite radical and stressing
a social democrat, proponent of a mixed economy, shall we say?
But certainly a mixed economy, but also stressing the significance of experimentation. On the other hand, I mean, it's not clear that he lined up politically anywhere with. And I mean, in Britain, especially, just because of the two-party system, the first past the post system, it effectively means that people have got very limited political choices. And I mean, I think the most conservative that Popper gets is in the comments from the 1950s, which again I fished out of the correspondence, where something of his was included in the Freeman's Library, and he made some comments about that. But I think, you know, there's I mean, I think McGee was probably right in terms of a reading of what Popper's politics were like. Although McGee was a British Labour MP, but the British Labour Party stood somewhere rather different from McGee, as one can see from the fact that McGee joined the Social Democrats rather than staying with the Labour Party. So that's my reaction there, for what it's worth.
Very, very quick question. What stuff from McGee could one read best about Popper?
Well, I think there's his book, The New Radicalism,
okay.
Which was an early book. The other thing is that if you are in Austria, then to go to Klagenfurt and to have a look at the...
Hi, Thomas.
and to have a look at the early correspondence between McGee and Popper is quite interesting.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, I have Thomas and then Margareta.
Well, hi. Yeah, everybody's welcome to come to Klagenfurt and, of course, take a look at the Popper archive. I have a rather comment than a question on the first point by Philip Benesch, and then I have a small question, which is rather short. And I was also somehow puzzled by the later isolation that was mentioned and his surprising later engagement with politics, or rather topics of public interest, and the issues that had been mentioned, on which Popper wrote about, the Balkan War and television and some of this stuff wasn't published as essays in academic journals, but it was published in newspapers. And many of those texts were published as letters to the editor. Some of them appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, and there were also letters to the editor on Popper commented on Churchill's politics, for instance, and he wrote a letter on the situation of London hospitals. And all these letters come from the 80s and from the 90s. And I think at least that this can be explained at least to some part, that Popper, especially in the German-speaking countries, became some sort of public intellectual. He was a knight and sir, he was a famous philosopher and that kind of stuff, and people just came to him and asked him to comment on current events. I'm not even sure if it was came from his intention to comment on all these things, but somehow developed from people approaching him. Maybe so. I don't know, maybe it is a question, not a comment. But the question that I wanted to ask is quite addressing Jeremy personally. Why did Popper have research assistants and secretaries when he was in retirement? Is this something usual in the UK, or something for the situation of Popper? I'm curious.
Okay. Essentially, Popper was still working full-time or more than full-time up to the point when he died. And it's also the case that Popper was living in quite an isolated spot. I mean, it wasn't that physically all of that far from London, but it was quite a journey. And so I mean, all the time he'd been at the LSE, he had got some, I think he'd had a research assistant paid for by the LSE, and certainly a part-time, well, he would have had a departmental secretary, and as a professor, a principal call on the time of a secretary. And what then happens, and I'm just trying to get this right, my understanding was that this was originally paid for by the LSE. I think when he retired, the LSE made an application to the Nuffield Foundation and got external funding paid to them, which then was responsible for the salary of his part-time secretary and myself. This then had to be renewed from time to time, but it continued to be renewed. In practical terms, you have to think of all of this as taking place in a situation where all of his working materials had to get from wherever they were to pen. They had to be located, borrowed, whatever. It's also the case that you were dealing through all of this period with typewriters, and his regular mode of operation was that he would write things. His wife would typically do a first draft of the typing up of these things, which he would then annotate. And then when I went down to see him, this would be given to me. So it meant that the manuscript would still be there, but that the typescript would then come with me. And just given what he was doing, it just, I think, would have been impossible if he'd been on his own doing it. I should also say that well, two things. First, the long list of things he gave me over the telephone every morning were typically papers suggested that he got references to from scientific papers that people were sending him. So he was, in general terms, doing his own work in philosophy, but was reading material across the physical and biological sciences. He was not consulting all that much work in contemporary philosophy. But it was unusual, but my suspicion is that if people, how can I put it? If people were in Oxford, they would then have easy access to the Bodleian Library. If you're living in Penn, Buckinghamshire, you have no access to anything. I here in Dumfries have, I don't know how many thousand books, plus also access to everything on the internet. He had really very little in terms of books at his house. Okay, I've got Margareta next. You're muted.
3 points of clarification, if you could. The first one is this about Popper. I read that somewhere, I don't know where, dus that when his wife was dying, she wanted to die in Austria. And so I think that was when they sold their house, I'm not sure. And then they went to Austria, Vienna, and there was some talk I heard about him leading some institute. And then that didn't work out. And then he came back to England. And so then I was wondering, together with that, Melita knew, did she become an assistant before that, during that, after that? And then my second point is actually about Bartley and Hayek. And since you have worked on Hayek, you may have some light on that. So Bartley volunteered to write Popper's a biography or some work of substance. But then apparently he also volunteers to do the same thing about Hayek. And so I'm wondering whether actually somehow that Popper was put on in second place and that Bartley started working on Hayek instead of really finishing the work on Popper. So was there some conflict that you're aware of, or is that all just an impression at the outside?
Okay, let me take the two things in turn. The first of them, I really know nothing about. All I would say is, and I'm sure that there must be people in Austria who do know all about this, and one would need to get them to talk about it, but there was this institute. My impression was that Popper's expectations of what it would consist of were rather different from what in fact was on offer. But I just simply don't know about that period. I mean, I was, I wasn't in close contact with Popper. I mean, I did a little bit of work for him, but I wasn't in close contact with him. As to Mrs. Mew, I mean, basically, she was employed as his secretary rather than as his academic assistant, but she was herself either German or Austrian in origin and had fluent German, and was involved in some academic work. My impression too was that her husband and their financial circumstances, Thomas says she was German, that her financial circumstances were very different from, say, that of my wife, who was dependent on a part-time job at the LSE for for household expenses. I think her husband was really quite wealthy, and so I think the relationship there was really rather different. And I think that after, I mean, in the end, Popper sold his house, and they bought something that quite close to where the Muse were living, and I think they were able to get him all kinds of practical assistance as well. But what I would say is, I mean, I was in Edinburgh, Manchester, briefly in London, where I wasn't able to get into the lecture on Darwinism that he was giving to the Royal Society. But then I was in America and Australia for 30 years. So the latter part, I just wasn't knowledgeable about at all. As to Bartley, the key situation really is this. He undertook work. I mean, he was doing more than you suggested. Hayek's papers were, I think, sold to the Hoover Institution. Bartley then became interested in Hayek, and he did some work to assist him, including basically drafting on the basis of other material of his a public lecture that he was giving. This impressed Hayek a lot, and Hayek then agreed that Bartley would edit this work, The Fatal Conceit. This really is a rather complicated business, but essentially Hayek had a lot of writing which had been judged when it was presented at a seminar to assist him by Jim Buchanan and other people to be unpublishable. Revision of it went on, but one can see from the material in the small Bartley archive at the Hoover, which relates to his time working on this stuff with Hayek, that there were major problems and huge discontinuities in the manuscript. And Bartley effectively took that over and drastically shortened it and edited it with Hayek's agreement, but where the plan had been that Hayek and Bartley would then go over it in detail together. In the event, Hayek became very seriously ill. He only ever partially recovered from this, but there is a slightly wistful comment somewhere where Hayek says, well, look, this is what I was wanting to say, but it doesn't sound like my voice saying it. Now, what then happened was that Bartley became editor of the Hayek collected works. He also agreed in principle to do a biography of Hayek and also the biography of Popper. Bartley was instrumental in getting Popper's papers sold to the Hoover Institution. Bartley then was working first on the Popper biography and did a lot of interviews for that, and was then going to turn to the Hayek stuff. I mean, he may have interviewed some people, but the substance of the work he was doing was on Popper. But the problem really then was that he came down with a particularly aggressive form of bladder cancer, and much as it were to the horror of everyone, not least Popper, just very quickly died. So what one got was him agreeing that one advanced chapter of the Popper biography could be given at the Montpellier Society. He gave it to them, but I think never actually presented on it. But someone that I know who was at the Montpellier Society got a copy. He said, well, look, you're working on Popper, you'd find this interesting. And I then referred to it. And I think the fact that and then indeed Malachi Harcohen, who was working on his book, said, well, look, I see you've referred to this. How do I get hold of a copy? And I sent him one. And at that point, it was basically released into the public. But as it had been given to the members of the Montpellier Society anyway, it wasn't like I'd been leaking a completely private document. So that really is the story there. And I would hope actually that some of the material that he collected about Popper from people in New Zealand who are now dead, this stuff might turn up at such point as Bartley's papers are available. Okay.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Yes.
I've got now Hussein and then Bob. Okay. Hussein is asking, he's written what was meant by the term programmatic ideas. What I was talking about there was the idea of a so-called metaphysical research program. And this is something that I've talked about earlier in the series of lectures. And so that's what I'm going back to in that context. Okay. Now, Bob.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. My name is Hassan. Thank you very much for sending me a set of your lectures. And so this is my son's computer that has named it Bob, so it appears as Bob. My question was that, what do you think the view of Popper would be these days that we don't have sort of totalitarian states as used to be like a Hitler or Mussolini and Stalin, but we have rather a sort of a special version of this kind of government, which are mostly like a rule of the mob and kind of like a people who just sort of appear to be like operating as like a mafia, and also a state in a sense is not a state as we can sort of imagine it, because it's just like some people like take over some buildings and occupy them and put their name on it and it becomes a state, but it is not a state. Let's say, you know, like some examples that happening now around the Middle East, etc. So it's like, in a way, I just want to see what you think his view would have been on this new version of sort of dictators, new version of states, this kind of like a kind of a new situation which has emerged.
Well, in some ways, it's difficult to say because a lot that's happened now relates to developments, particularly in information technology and communications, which just means our situation is very different. However, there is a sense in which a whole lot of things look horribly familiar, just in that if you think of the period that Popper was living through with the rise of Hitler, one has a lot of grim resemblances. Now, one might say, well, it then is rather strange because Popper himself obviously realized that not only wasn't there a future for him in academic employment in Austria, but that there wasn't a future. He lost a lot of his own family to National Socialism. He doesn't actually say a great deal about directly about Hitler-style politics and the Hitler-style regime. And I think that one might read, but Philip may come in and correct me here, that in many ways, the thrust of what he does is essentially appealing to people who are revolted by these developments to say, look, don't espouse the kind of Marxist understanding of things which has actually crippled effective engagement with an effective resistance. So, or if I can put this another way, I mean, I think that for Popper, if people are actively intolerant and in a position to do things, I mean, I think he thinks that there is no reason to tolerate them. But I think that the thrust of his work, as in the Open Society, was largely directed at people who are good-hearted but misled, either into tolerating some aspects of what was going on, or into things that he thought were counterproductive. And I would be tempted to say that it's suggestive in terms of Popper's approach to say, look, consider at the moment the opponents of the populist right. I mean, there's a sense in which, while one may not like many aspects of what he's doing, the sort of tactic that Joe Biden was taking to what was going on in America, saying, look, you know, let us see what we can agree about. Let us see what we can do to assist things in a practical way, as distinct from what is happening on the left of the Democrats in America, where you have all kinds of much more heady stuff, but which is it's in itself highly divisive. I mean, in the sense that there's going to be no more general agreement about that than there is for the nitwitted ideas for someone like Trump, and where also it seems to be divorced. I mean, a lot of it tends to be sort of the politics of emotional gestures, rather than talking about practical things to do with institutions and trying things out. Now, this, I think, I mean, I am not a fan of either of the main political parties in America, or indeed either of any of the political parties in Britain at the moment. But I think if one is after Popper's approach, it's really a kind of moderate social democracy, respecting of individual well-being, saying that we should experiment with things and learn, and bear in mind that we are ignorant, we're likely to make mistakes, we need to be open to critical feedback. Whether our current populations stoked up by social media will actually go with this, I'm not sure. But on the other side of it, I mean, Popper, after all, was writing at a time when people were responding to the stoking up of emotions by Hitler. So one can see in a certain sense the kind of terms in which he was writing. I don't know if that helps in the slightest.
I mean, what I see is that, like, as a sort of, as opposed to dichotomy of a dictator and a people that are following dictator, now we have like a situation that there are sort of like a people on top, which are not that much sort of with great ideas and disciplines and trying to change the society in a big deal, but rather you have like ordinary people that after a while they get fed up. Now they pick up a weapon and they become like a force, and they influence their system. And if the system is weak enough, they take over. So these guys, they are neither those big guys with big ideas or just the guys who follow. They are sort of like as if there is a business of being mujahid, a business of being a man with a gun.
Yeah.
So you adopt this as a business, and then society wants to kind of how society is going to respond to this kind of thing when there is no dialogue as such. It's like kind of like the people who attack White House, as it were.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, look, I would agree that there is the problem. I think all I can, well, I can make 2 points. I think on the one side, one can extract certain general kinds of approaches along the lines that I was doing. I think the other thing that really needs to be called out is the abandonment of a concern for truth. I mean, I certainly find that I mean, what currently seems to me to be utterly problematic is Trump as being an outright liar, and supporters of the Republican Party in the US going along with this stuff. I mean, how do you call someone to account if they simply aren't interested in whether what they're saying is true or false, consistent or inconsistent? And while I'm not saying that his policies are like that, it seems to me that the kind of thing, the style of politics that Trump was going in for, and which people have been supporting him in, is up there with Hitler in the sense of just a willingness. Now, I mean, this isn't a condemnation of every single thing that he did, and certainly not every single aspect of the people who supported him. But it seems to me that given that we're fallible, given that we need to learn from other people where we've got it wrong, to behave in this way or to countenance behavior of this kind is just inexcusable. I see now that we're now up to 9:10 my time. Is there anyone who wants to come in quickly with a further question? Hussein, your hand is still up there. Is that from your last question? Last question. And John, do you want to come back briefly? This will be it, I think.
Very briefly. No, I just wanted to say as a response to the question before, you do have to distinguish between, let's say, traditionalist, fascist kinds of movements on the one side, and the totalitarian of the left, that's where the big idea person is going to come along to try and radically change society. The stuff that comes from the right is much more going back to tradition. I think that maybe that explains the kind of phenomenon he was looking to explain. Yeah, that's all.
Okay, I will call a halt now. May I thank all of you who have stayed with these things. I've appreciated very much your questions and your keeping me honest to the best of your ability. I will send out the notes on this lot. I sent out a tentative program for the next set of lectures. If you've got criticism of that or comments or suggestions, just email me about them. And my intention will be to restart the second series of these things in May, and that, if it happens, will then run round to about the equivalent of now. And then possibly at this time in the equivalent thing, I might say, and the third series, and at this point, everyone runs off screaming. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Jeremy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Yeah, cheerio.
Bye-bye.